The helicopter went down somewhere over the Andes, and Ethan Ashford's body was never recovered. Grace Rivera stood at the edge of the memorial service 7 years ago, her hands trembling as she held a single white rose. She was 23 then, fresh out of business school, working as Ethan's executive assistant for barely 8 months. 8 months that had changed everything. They had been dancing around their feelings for weeks before he left for that fateful South American mining expedition. The last thing he had said to her, standing in his office doorway with that devastating smile, was, "When I get back, we need to talk about us." She had nodded, heart racing, not knowing those would be the last words he would ever speak to her. Now, at 30, Grace still worked at Ashford Industries. She had climbed the ranks to chief operating officer, second only to Ethan's younger brother Marcus, who had taken over as CEO after Ethan's death was declared official 2 years after the crash. The company had evolved from a mid-sized mineral extraction business into a diversified empire worth billions. But Grace barely cared about the money or the prestige. She came to work every day and sat in the building where Ethan's presence still lingered in every corner, every decision, every value the company upheld. People told her to move on. Her mother pleaded with her to date. Her friends set her up on blind dates that she politely declined or suffered through with mechanical smiles. But how could she explain that no one else made her feel the way Ethan had? That she still dreamed about him 3 nights a week? That she kept the last email he sent her saved on her phone, reading it whenever the loneliness became too heavy? "Grace, the quarterly reports are ready for your review," her assistant Jennifer said, poking her head into the spacious office that overlooked downtown Seattle. Rain pelted the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city gray and brooding below. "Thank you, just leave them on my desk." Grace rubbed her temples. Another headache was forming, the third this week. Jennifer hesitated. "Are you okay? You have not seemed yourself lately." Grace forced a smile. "I am fine, just tired." It was more than tired. It was 7 years of carrying grief like a stone in her chest. 7 years of what-ifs and almosts. 7 years of walking past Ethan's old office, now converted into a conference room, and remembering the way he used to lean against his desk when they talked, eyes bright with passion about whatever project consumed him that week. The afternoon crawled by. Grace reviewed contracts, approved budgets, mediated a dispute between 2 department heads. The work was endless, and she was grateful for the distraction. At 6 o'clock, when most of the office had emptied, she finally allowed herself to pack up. Her condo was only 15 minutes away, a modern space with excellent city views that felt hollow every time she walked through the door. She was gathering her things when Marcus appeared in her doorway. At 34, he looked remarkably like his older brother, same dark hair, same strong jaw, but his eyes were different. Where Ethan's had been warm amber, Marcus's were cool gray. "Grace, do you have a minute?" she nodded, setting down her bag. Marcus entered and closed the door behind him, which was unusual. They had a good working relationship, professional and cordial, though she sometimes caught him looking at her with something like pity, as if he knew she was still hung up on his dead brother. "I received a strange call today," he began, sitting across from her desk. "From the Peruvian government." Grace's heart skipped. Peru, the Andes, the crash. What did they want? They found something. Wreckage from the helicopter. The site was remote, only discovered because of a landslide last month. Marcus leaned forward. "Grace, they found evidence that someone might have survived the initial crash." The room tilted. Grace gripped the edge of her desk. "What kind of evidence?" "A makeshift shelter." Signs of long-term habitation. The wreckage was in a valley so isolated that whoever survived would have had no way out. The terrain is nearly impossible to navigate, and the area is prone to rockslides. Marcus's voice was careful, measured. "They want to send an expedition to investigate further." "I wanted to tell you before it hits the news." "When?" Grace could barely force the word out. "They are leaving in 3 days. I am going with them." "I am coming too." Grace, I do not think that is a good idea. It is going to be dangerous, and there is no guarantee we will find anything conclusive. She stood, planting her palms on the desk. Marcus, I am coming. Do not try to stop me. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Okay, we leave Thursday morning. The next 2 days were a blur of preparations. Grace barely slept, her mind racing with possibilities. What if Ethan had survived? What if he had been stranded in those mountains all this time? The rational part of her brain said it was impossible, that no one could survive 7 years alone in the Andes. But the part of her that had never stopped loving him clung to a desperate, fragile hope. They flew to Lima, then took a smaller plane to Cusco, and finally a helicopter to the remote site where the original crash had occurred. Grace's stomach churned as the helicopter flew over the endless peaks and valleys. This was the last flight Ethan had taken. These were the last mountains he had seen. The expedition team consisted of Grace, Marcus, 2 Peruvian search and rescue specialists named Carlos and Javier, and a local guide named Paulo who knew the area better than anyone. They set up base camp at the crash site, a narrow valley hemmed in by sheer cliff walls. The wreckage was still there, the twisted metal of the helicopter now rusted and covered in moss. The shelter is this way, Carlos said, gesturing to the north end of the valley. They hiked for 20 minutes before finding it. A crude structure built from branches, helicopter parts, and stones. It was small, barely large enough for one person to lie down in, but it was clearly human-made. Someone lived here, Javier said, crouching to examine the ground. Look, a fire pit, and these marks on the stones, someone was keeping count. Grace's throat tightened. Etched into a flat rock near the shelter were hundreds of small lines grouped in sets of 5. Days, someone had been counting days. How many? She whispered. Javier counted slowly. 812. 812 days, over 2 years. So they survived at least that long, Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. But then what? Where did they go? Paulo, the guide, was examining the area with a practiced eye. There is a path here. Very faint, very old, but it exists. Someone traveled this way. He pointed to the eastern cliff wall where a narrow crack was barely visible. That leads to another valley, and beyond that, perhaps a way down. We have to follow it, Grace said immediately. They spent the night at base camp. Grace could not eat, could not rest. She lay in her tent listening to the wind howl through the valley and thought about Ethan huddled in that pathetic shelter, hurt and alone, counting days and probably thinking no one would ever find him. The grief she had carried for 7 years transformed into something sharper, more painful. If he had survived, if he had suffered, and she had been back in Seattle living her life, going to work, sleeping in her comfortable bed while he struggled in these mountains, she did not know if she could forgive herself. At first light, they set out following the path Paulo had discovered. It was treacherous, barely more than a goat trail winding along the cliff face. One wrong step would send them plummeting hundreds of feet. Grace kept her eyes forward, her hands gripping the rock wall, and forced herself to breathe. The path led to another valley, this one with a small stream running through it. Signs of old campfires dotted the area. He was moving, Marcus said, wonder in his voice. He was trying to find his way out. They followed the stream for hours, through 2 more valleys, each one slightly lower in elevation than the last. The landscape gradually shifted from barren rock to scrubby vegetation. They were descending, slowly but surely. On the 3rd day of tracking, they found a village. Not on any map, not accessible by road, just a tiny settlement of about 15 families living in the traditional way, herding alpacas and farming terraced fields on the mountainside. Paulo spoke to the villagers in rapid Quechua. Grace watched their faces, trying to read the conversation. An older woman kept gesturing to the north, her expression animated. She says a man came to their village, a stranger with light eyes and a broken body. That was over 4 years ago, Paulo translated. He was sick, barely alive. They nursed him back to health, but he had lost his memory. He could not tell them who he was or where he came from. He stayed with them for a few months, then left one day, saying he needed to find something, though he did not know what. Grace's legs nearly gave out. Marcus caught her arm. Did they say where he went? Marcus asked urgently. More discussion in Quechua. The old woman pointed north again, then spoke at length. She says he talked about the ocean. He felt pulled toward the coast. They told him it was many weeks of walking, but he went anyway. 4 years ago, Grace said, her mind racing. He could be anywhere by now. How do we find him? Carlos pulled out a satellite phone. I will contact the Peruvian authorities. If a man matching Ethan's description has been living here without documents, there might be records. Hospitals, police stations, shelters. It took 6 days of frantic searching, phone calls, database checks, and favor calling before they got a lead. A clinic in the coastal city of Trujillo had treated a man with amnesia about 3.5 years ago. He had given the name Diego because he could not remember his real one. The clinic had referred him to a social worker who had helped him find work at a fishing cooperative. Grace was on the next flight to Trujillo. The fishing cooperative was located on the beach, a weathered building surrounded by boats and nets. Grace walked toward it with her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Marcus was beside her, looking equally shaken. We do not know if it is him, Marcus said, but his voice was hopeful. A man was working on one of the boats, his back to them. He was tall, lean, his skin bronzed by the sun. His dark hair was longer than Ethan had worn it, tied back in a small knot at the nape of his neck. He was mending a net with practiced hands, his movements efficient and sure. Excuse me, Grace called out in Spanish. Are you Diego? The man turned around. Time stopped. It was Ethan. Older, weathered, a scar running down the left side of his face from temple to jaw, but unmistakably Ethan. Those amber eyes, that particular way he held himself, the shape of his mouth. Yes, I am Diego, he said in Spanish, his expression polite but puzzled. Can I help you? Grace could not speak. Tears were streaming down her face. Marcus stepped forward, his own eyes wet. Ethan, Marcus's voice broke. It is me, Marcus, your brother. Diego, Ethan, whoever he was, stared at them blankly. I am sorry, I think you have confused me with someone else. My name is Diego. You lost your memory in the mountains, Grace managed to say, her voice shaking. There was a helicopter crash 7 years ago. You are Ethan Ashford. You are from Seattle. Something flickered in his eyes, confusion, then a flash of pain. He raised a hand to his temple. I do not understand. I have had dreams, fragments, but the doctors said they were just my brain trying to fill in the blanks. Marcus pulled out his phone, showing him pictures. Ethan before the crash, smiling in his office. Ethan and Marcus as teenagers. The Ashford Industries building. Diego. Ethan took the phone with trembling hands. He stared at the pictures for a long time. This is me, he whispered. I know that is me, but I do not remember. That is okay, Grace said, stepping closer. She wanted to touch him, to throw her arms around him and never let go, but she held herself back. He did not know her. To him, she was a stranger. We can help you remember, or if you never remember, that is okay too. We just need you to come home. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something in his expression shifted. You seem familiar, he said softly, switching to English as if the language came back naturally. Your eyes. I have dreamed about eyes like yours. Grace let out a sob she could not contain. My name is Grace Rivera. I worked with you. We were friends. Friends seemed like such an inadequate word for what they had been, what she had felt, but it was all she could offer him now. Over the next hours, they sat in a small cafe near the beach and told Ethan everything. Who he was, what had happened, the company, his life before the crash. Marcus showed him legal documents, news articles about the crash, photos of their parents who had both passed away before the accident. Ethan listened, his expression shifting between disbelief and something like grief. I built a life here, he said finally. It is simple, but it is mine. I have friends, a routine. I help support the cooperative. I do not know if I can just leave all that. You do not have to decide right now, Marcus said, but at least come back to Seattle for a while. See if being there helps. Get proper medical care. We have been searching for you for 7 years, Ethan. We never stopped hoping." Ethan's eyes found Grace again. "Were we close before the crash?" "Yes," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We were very close. Tell me how we met." Grace took a shaky breath. "You hired me as your assistant right out of graduate school. I was terrified on my first day. I spilled coffee all over your desk within the first hour. You just laughed and helped me clean it up. You said anyone who could make such a spectacular first impression was going to do just fine." A faint smile touched his lips. "That sounds like something I would say, or maybe something the person I used to be would say." "You are still that person," Marcus insisted. "You just need time." Ethan agreed to return to Seattle for a month, to see if being in his old environment triggered any memories. Grace arranged everything, handling the logistics with the kind of efficiency that had made her invaluable to Ashford Industries. Within 3 days, they were flying back to the States. Seattle was in the middle of an unusually sunny spring when they arrived. Grace had prepared Ethan's old penthouse, which Marcus had kept exactly as it was, unable to bring himself to clear it out. Walking into that space was surreal. Ethan moved through the rooms like a ghost touching furniture, looking at photos on the walls, his expression unreadable. "I own all this," he asked, gesturing around the expensive space with its view of Elliott Bay. "You did. You worked hard for it," Marcus said. "Everything you built is still here, Ethan. The company has grown, but it is still based on your vision, your values." Ethan sat down heavily on the couch. "This is overwhelming." "I know," Grace said gently. She sat across from him, maintaining distance even though every cell in her body wanted to be closer. "Take your time, there is no pressure." Over the following weeks, they reintroduced Ethan to his old life. Doctors examined him, confirming severe head trauma that had caused the amnesia, but no current medical concerns. He visited the office, meeting employees who wept when they saw him. He reviewed business documents, trying to piece together what kind of man he had been. Grace spent every day with him. She told him stories about their time working together, about his passion for ethical mining practices, his insistence on fair labor conditions, his dream of building a company that proved you could be successful without compromising your values. She showed him emails they had exchanged, careful to avoid the ones that hinted at their growing feelings. That seemed too personal, too much for him to handle right now, but being around him was torture of the sweetest kind. He looked like Ethan, sounded like Ethan when he laughed, which was becoming more frequent. Sometimes he would say something or make a gesture that was so quintessentially him that Grace's heart would clench. But he did not remember her, did not remember what had been growing between them before the crash. One evening, about 3 weeks after his return, they were sitting in his penthouse watching the sun set over the Sound. Ethan had been quiet all day, withdrawn. "What are you thinking about?" Grace asked. "I am trying to figure out who I am," he said. "Everyone tells me about Ethan Ashford, this driven businessman, this good man who cared about making the world better. But I do not feel like him. I feel like Diego, the fisherman who was happy with a simple life. I do not know if I can be the person everyone wants me to be." Grace moved to sit beside him on the couch. "Then do not be whoever you are now. No one is asking you to pretend." "You are," he said, turning to look at her. "I see how you look at me sometimes. Like you are waiting for someone to come back, but I do not know if that person still exists." Tears pricked Grace's eyes. "I am sorry, I do not mean to make you uncomfortable." "You do not," he said quickly. He reached out, hesitating, then took her hand. It was the first time he had initiated physical contact. "Grace, what were we to each other? Really?" She looked down at their joined hands. "We were falling in love," she admitted. "At least I was. You told me before you left for Peru that we needed to talk about us when you got back. I have spent 7 years wondering what you would have said." Ethan was quiet for a long time. "I do not remember loving you," he finally said, and the words cut deeper than anything Grace had ever felt. "But I think I am starting to." Grace looked up sharply. "What?" I do not have memories of who we were, but I know how I feel now. You are the only person who makes this all feel bearable. When you smile, something in my chest loosens. When you tell me stories about the past, I do not care if I remember them or not because I just like hearing your voice. I wake up every morning thinking about seeing you. I do not know if that is an echo of who I used to be or something new, but it is real. Grace's hand tightened on his. Ethan. I want to try, he said. I want to see where this goes even without the memories. Is that okay? She nodded, not trusting her voice. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. When his lips met hers, soft and tentative, Grace felt 7 years of grief and longing break apart into something that felt like hope. The kiss was gentle, exploratory, two people learning each other for the first time even though her heart remembered everything. When they pulled apart, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. This feels right, he whispered. Yes, Grace agreed. It does. Their relationship grew from there, different from what might have been but beautiful in its own way. Ethan decided to stay in Seattle to reclaim his position at Ashford Industries alongside Marcus, who was more than happy to share leadership with his brother. Ethan brought new perspectives from his years living simply in Peru, pushing the company toward even more sustainable practices and better profit sharing with workers. Grace and Ethan dated like any normal couple, going to dinners, walking through Pike Place Market, taking weekend trips to the San Juan Islands. Every moment felt precious to Grace because she knew how easily she could have never had this. Sometimes Ethan would get flashes of memory, fragments that made him pause mid-sentence with a confused look on his face. Grace learned not to push, to let him process in his own time. 6 months after his return, they were hiking in the Cascades when Ethan suddenly stopped on the trail. Grace turned back, concerned. "Are you okay?" "I remember something," he said, his voice strange. "We were in my office. It was late. Everyone else had gone home. We were working on the environmental impact report for the Chilean contract. You had your hair up in a clip and you kept pushing your glasses up when you were concentrating. I made a joke about something, I cannot remember what, and you laughed. You have this laugh that it lit up the whole room. And I thought, I am going to marry this woman someday." Grace's breath caught. "You remember that?" "I remember that," he confirmed. He closed the distance between them, taking her face in his hands. "Grace, I do not know if I will ever get all the memories back, but I do not need them. I know what I want now." "What do you want?" "You, always you." "Marry me." It was not the most traditional proposal. They're on a hiking trail with the late afternoon sun filtering through the trees, but it was perfect. Grace said yes through happy tears, and Ethan kissed her like he was making up for 7 lost years. They married 4 months later in a small ceremony overlooking the Sound. Marcus was Ethan's best man, tears streaming unashamedly down his face as he watched his brother, returned from the dead, pledge his life to the woman who had never given up hope. Grace's parents were there, her mother crying into a handkerchief, her father beaming with pride. As they exchanged vows, Ethan spoke from the heart. "I do not know what I did to deserve a second chance at life, or to find someone who waited for me even when the world said I was gone. Grace, you could have moved on, everyone would have understood, but you did not. And now I get to spend the rest of my life proving that your faith in me, in us, was not misplaced. I love you with everything I am, with all the memories I have lost and all the ones we are going to make together." Grace's vows were simpler. "I loved you before, I love you now, I will love you always. Nothing, not even death, could change that." They honeymooned in Peru, returning to the village where Ethan had been saved. They brought gifts, resources, and funding to improve the village's infrastructure. The old woman who had nursed Ethan back to health embraced him like a son, and through Paulo's translation, told him she had always known he would find his way home. "Home is not a place," Ethan said, holding Grace close as they stood in the mountain village under more stars than they ever saw in Seattle. "Home is you." 3 years into their marriage, Grace gave birth to twin girls. They named them Luna and Stella, stars to light their way. Ethan was a devoted father, often working from home so he could be present for every moment. He still had gaps in his memory, probably always would, but it stopped mattering. The life they built together was full and rich and real. On their 5th anniversary, they stood on the balcony of their home, a house they had bought together in the suburbs with a big yard for the girls. Luna and Stella were asleep inside, worn out from a day at the zoo. The evening was warm, unusual for Seattle, and Grace leaned back against Ethan's chest as they watched the stars emerge. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if they had not found that wreckage?" Grace asked. "If you had just stayed in Peru as Diego forever?" Ethan's arms tightened around her. "Sometimes, but I think I would have found my way back to you eventually. Some things are just meant to be." "You really believe that?" "I survived a helicopter crash. I lived alone in the mountains for over 2 years. I walked halfway across Peru with no memory of who I was, and somehow I ended up back here with you. If that is not fate, I do not know what is." Grace turned in his arms, looking up at him. "I never stopped believing you were out there somewhere. Everyone thought I was crazy." "You were crazy," Ethan said with a grin. "Crazy and stubborn and loyal to a fault. Thank God for that." He kissed her deep and slow, the kind of kiss that still made her knees weak after all these years. When they pulled apart, Grace rested her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. "I waited 7 years for you," she said softly. "I know, and I would have waited 70 for you." Inside, one of the twins started crying and they both laughed. "Duty calls," Ethan said, but he stole one more kiss before they went inside to tend to their daughter. Later that night, after the girls were settled and the house was quiet, Grace found Ethan in his study. He was looking at an old photo from before the crash, one of the few that included both of them. They were at a company picnic, standing slightly apart but their body language unmistakably drawn to each other. "I wish I could remember that day," Ethan said when he noticed her in the doorway. Grace came to stand beside him. "We played softball. You were terrible at it. I hit a home run and you cheered louder than anyone else. Then we sat by the lake and talked until the sun went down. You told me about your dream to expand into renewable energy. I told you about wanting to make a real difference in the world, not just shuffle papers. You said I already was making a difference just by being who I was." Ethan pulled her close. "I do not remember it, but I am not surprised I said that. You have always made a difference, Grace. You made all the difference. So have you. You came back to me. That is all I ever wanted." They stood there in the quiet study, holding each other, two people who had been given a second chance that most never got. Outside, Seattle glittered with a million lights, each one a life, a story, a possibility. But in this moment, Grace and Ethan had everything they needed. The years that followed were filled with the ordinary magic of a life built together. Ethan continued to lead Ashford Industries alongside Marcus, transforming it into one of the most ethically run companies in their industry. Grace eventually stepped back to spend more time with their daughters, though she consulted on major decisions and remained on the board. Luna and Stella grew into bright, curious children who loved hearing the story of how their father survived in the mountains, though Grace and Ethan always edited out the scarier parts. On the 10-year anniversary of Ethan's return to Seattle, they threw a party. Not just for them, but for everyone who had been part of the journey. Marcus was there with his wife and son. The Peruvian officials who had found the wreckage came, along with Carlos, Javier, and Paulo. They even video-called the village in the mountains, the old woman who had saved Ethan's life appearing on screen to offer her blessings. As Grace looked around the room at all these people whose lives had been touched by Ethan's story, by their story, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. So many things had to align perfectly for this moment to exist. The landslide that revealed the wreckage, Marcus's decision to pursue the lead, her insistence on going to Peru, the villagers who had shown compassion to a stranger. Ethan's determination to survive, even when he did not know what he was surviving for. Ethan found her standing by the window, watching their daughters play with Marcus's son in the yard. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, slipping his arm around her waist. I am thinking about how lucky we are, how easily we could have missed each other entirely. But we did not, Ethan said firmly. We found each other, Grace, twice. That has to count for something. It counts for everything. He turned her to face him, his amber eyes warm with love. I got my memories back, not all of them, but enough. I remembered what I was going to say to you that day before I left for Peru. Grace's heart skipped. You did, when, a few months ago, I did not tell you because I wanted to wait for the right moment. He cupped her face gently. I was going to tell you that I loved you, that I had probably loved you from the moment you spilled coffee everywhere and looked at me like the world was ending. I was going to ask you to take a chance on me, on us, even though it complicated things professionally. I was going to promise that I would do everything in my power to make you happy. Tears slipped down Grace's cheeks. You kept that promise even without remembering it, and I will keep it for the rest of our lives, Ethan said. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. You waited for me when I was lost. Now I get to spend forever making sure you never regret it. I could never regret loving you, Grace whispered. Never. As the party continued around them, as their children played and their friends laughed, and the sun set over Seattle in shades of gold and pink, Grace and Ethan held each other close. They had been given a miracle, a second chance that defied all logic and probability. And they had built something beautiful from it, a love that had survived death, distance, amnesia, and time itself. Some people search their whole lives and never find what Grace and Ethan had found twice. They never took it for granted, never forgot how easily it could have been lost forever. Every morning they woke up together was a gift. Every shared smile, every inside joke, every quiet moment was precious. Years later, when their daughters were grown and starting families of their own, when Ethan's hair had gone silver and Grace had laugh lines around her eyes, they still held hands like teenagers. They still looked at each other like they were seeing something miraculous, because they were. They were seeing the person they had crossed mountains and time and every obstacle imaginable to be with. You think we will find each other in the next life too? Grace asked one evening as they sat on their porch watching the sun set. Ethan squeezed her hand. Absolutely. I will always find my way back to you, Grace, always. And looking at him, at the life they had built, at the love that had refused to die even when the world declared it dead, Grace believed him. Some loves were just that powerful. Some loves could survive anything. Theirs was one of them. They had been given 7 years apart and a lifetime together. And every single day, they chose each other all over again. It was the greatest story Grace knew. Better than anything she could have imagined that day, she stood at Ethan's memorial service holding a white rose and refusing to let go of hope. She had waited for him. And he had come back to her. And that made all the difference in the world.